I'm Rachel. I'm based in Chicago. I've worked in the industry for 25 years, just sad to say, and I've been a sommelier for 15 years. And I'm lucky because I've been able to work in several markets during my time in the industry. So I started in Chicago, I moved out to New York City, worked in restaurants and hotel groups out there, and then moved out to Napa for a while, and then ended up back in Chicago where I worked at another hotel group, and then moved into my position at Levy. So originally I was just overseeing Spiaggia and the fine dining restaurant there. In 2018 I moved into Director of Beverage for the Levy Restaurant Group. And then, as we all know, COVID happened and all of that. So Spiaggia is actually since closed, which is really sad. End of an era. But I've since been promoted to Director of Beverage Operations for Levy nationally. So in case you aren't all familiar, Levy is kind of one of the powerhouse companies leading sports and entertainment. So we have about 200 stadiums and parks and things like that nationally. And then in addition, we also have the restaurant division. So we have a lot of cool opportunities to play with beverage. And so I'm here to kind of talk about that today and lend my insight. So to begin, when I was broached to talk about this topic, I kind of sat down and I thought about, when I've been presented with the opportunity for bulk production or private label placements, what do I want and what do I want to hear, what do I not want to hear? To me, I have some very specific things that I think are positive and negatives. So I kind of outlined five major points. Sorry, going slow. So I'm going to be very casual today. Obviously, we have Q&A at the end, but if anybody has any questions throughout my talk, please feel free to raise your hand. But mainstay here, the juice has to be good, right? I mean, that's stating the obvious, but is it? I have been presented with a lot of juice that is not good. And so that's really important. And then also, you have to know who you're presenting to. Don't just come in blindly and present something to me without knowing the brand. And we'll get into that later. But I'll talk about that. I mean, varietal correctness, Chardonnay, for example. I mean, there's very polarizing styles of Chardonnay, right? Some people really love that opulent, oaky, even a hint of residual sugar on the palate Chardonnay. Some people love Chablis, right? Not oaks, just zippy, high acid and clean. I would say if you're going to present me with a Chardonnay, come somewhere in the middle. I want something that will make the entire crowd happy, right? Everyone happy. It's not going to freak anybody out. And it's similar to that, say Cabernet Sauvignon. Don't come to me with something that's just juicy and insipid. I want something that represents Cabernet Sauvignon that's got a little bit of structure, but also has the fruit to cater to the Napa Cabernet loving crowd, right? It has to have balance. So that's number one. I think varietally speaking, that's important. Another thing that I think is important is don't push off varietals on me. Say you have a bunch of excess Riesling, and you were like, oh, here, use this private label Riesling. And we'd be like, no. Riesling's great by all means, but maybe create a white blend for me to taste that would be more crowd pleasing. I'd say white blends and red blends go over much better for the general public than, say, a monovarietal Riesling. So give me a Chenin Blanc Riesling blend, something like that, an aromatic white blend. I think that would be more likely to be sellable. Oxidation, I think, is another really important key point here. You should come having tested how long the longevity or shelf stability of your product is. If I'm going to be pouring this wine by the glass and I open it and the next day it's just totally oxidized, that's not cool. This product has to represent what we do. It's an extension of my restaurant group or my stadium or whatever, more so applicable in this case for the restaurant group. So it needs to be stable, and different varietals oxidize at a faster rate, so that's something to think about too. I have a friend in Chicago who would, considering it, she ran a restaurant group, and she would think about a placement for a glass pour, and it was like a top of the fridge test. So she would open a bottle, if it was red, dump out half of it, put a cork in it, put it on the top of a refrigerator for a week, and then taste it. Now, obviously, it's going to be oxidized at that point, but the level of oxidation was what she was looking for. And if it was okay, she would consider it for a placement. Same for Chardonnay, or a white wine, excuse me. Put it in the fridge, having poured out half of it, taste it in a week. I mean, I feel like white wine oxidizes at a lower rate, but still something to consider, because that's all very important. Are you going to offer a Coravin or a system for preservation? Personally, I'm not a huge Coravin fan. I'd rather the product speaks for itself and holds up well. But in some cases, that could be applicable. And then the other thing about varietal is you could consider sourcing. Obviously, there's Napa, there are specific AVAs, and then there's the generic California appellation. Obviously, the fruit from Napa or any sub-AVA is going to be a lot more expensive to source. So you could source fruit from Paso Robles, for example, label this wine California fruit, and generally speaking, our clients are going to be really excited to recognize it as from California. They don't need to know that it's from Napa specifically, and so that only helps you as well as us in terms of pricing on bottom line. All right, let's go here. Obviously, we already talked about private label. It's a win-win situation. Like, if this wine sells for us, it's going to sell for you. It's a great opportunity for partnership. And if we strike up a good partnership with you, we're going to consider you for future products, future projects and things that we can work with you on as we move forward and open more locations, etc. But it's true, a lot of people do mess this up. I've worked with people who have really dropped the ball, unfortunately. So things to think about. So I'm going to go through, obviously, juice has to be good. I already talked about the varietals, oxidation, preservation, and the sourcing of AVAs. We already talked about that. When I talk about stay on brand, I'm talking about my brand, not your brand. I understand as distributors, you're thinking about your brand. I'm thinking about my restaurant brand or my S&E brand or whatever it is that I'm choosing to place this product in. So who do we serve? I've always had a pet peeve about having somebody come in and try and present wine to me having no idea what my concept is about. Don't come into my Italian restaurant and bring me some kind of off-brand wine. That just pisses me off, and I'm not going to work with you. Do your homework. Come in prepared and know what we're representing as wherever we are, whatever we are. So think about that. Are we a quick service venue? Is this a theater where you have intermissions and you just need a box of wine or something quick to break open and pour? Are we focused on millennials? Are we focused on an older group who knows their wine? Come to the table knowing what we're doing. And transparency. So this is huge to me because I've had people come in really hot trying to sell me private label wines. They come in, they're like, I've got this Cabernet from Red Mountain, and I've got this Sauvignon Blanc from Napa, and this Rosé from Portugal, and I'm going to do this, and this. And then they disappear. I'm not going to name names, but drop off the face of the planet and then pop up again. And this lack of consistency and transparency is obviously just an absolute no. If we are going to strike up a partnership, it has to be based on trust and transparency. So I understand, right? There is a supply chain issue right now. That is present. It's an issue. It's a big, big issue. But you still need to communicate with me, and even if it's something I don't want to know, I'd like to hear it. I'd like to know where we stand. And then don't overpromise and underdeliver. I mean, I'm not going to be very happy with you if I give you a glass pour, a local or a national level, and there are outages. Like, that's just unacceptable. If it's in print, if it's something where, like, depending on, don't run out and don't have outages. That's just infuriating. So offer more. Can you offer creative? Some private labels come to me and they're like, okay, we can work with you on the marketing. We can work with you on the label production and creative. This is all like very cool and can set you apart from others who are trying to pitch me for private labels. We think about the company scope. So, for example, say we wanted to, at Levy, feature this juice in our restaurant group as our house, say Cabernet, and then in stadiums. Like, come prepared with options for different packaging. Maybe we would like to offer one in keg here and say in the stadium a box of this wine, and say in the restaurant 750 ml, right? Or half bottles. Come prepared with that knowledge of what you can do, what you can provide me, as well as the pricing of all of these. The structure is really important to know. And then also, obviously, if we're gonna sell this nationally, you need to be well versed in all of the regulations specific to each state, because labeling is important. Front and back label, all the requirements is a major play. And then finally, obviously, margins are huge. This is an opportunity not only for us to make a profit, but for you as well. I mean, obviously, the beauty of a private label is it's not anywhere else. There's no other placement, or at least the juice, nobody knows where the juice is elsewhere, right? It's our label, it's specific to our brand and our company. And again, an extension of what we represent and the quality that we choose to represent. So that's going back to the juice has to be good, the creative has to be good, this has to represent our brand. And then when you think about the price structure, I mean, when I go to create my Buy the Glass programs in the restaurant group, for example, I choose specifically products that do not have a bunch of retail exposure, right? Like, I want minimal retail exposure so that my guests, A, don't know what I'm charging them, obviously, right? And B, they haven't seen this wine everywhere. Like, I want them to have a very specific experience with our restaurant group, and to be able to, create an experience with them and a story behind the wines. So I think that's important. So that leads into the next thing. When I go into pricing those wines that are not a private label wine, say I paid $12 for this one wine, and I'm going to charge $12 by the glass, right? That's about my restriction or my company outline. But say you come to me with this wine that we're going to try and pour by the glass, that's maybe going to be our fastest selling glass pour because it's recognizable, say it's Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's $9 to me, right? I could then sell it for $12 and nobody would know the difference. And that's the major plus in working with you and benefiting from a relationship and profitability by being able to utilize this margin. It's a great margin. So consistency in product availability again. And again, lastly, I think private label allows us, like I said, in any glass pour or program placement, there should be a story behind the wine, and be able to say that this is something that is an extension of us and that we can offer you specifically and only from our locations is a really great story as it is. So I think that's all really important to discuss. I think I'm really fast. Do you guys have any questions? I mean, I have plenty of things I can share. Yeah?
Does private label spirits come up on your radar at all? Is that something that's interesting, like wine, or not really?
Yeah, for sure. I poured a private label vodka from a local company that, it's like $10 a liter. And it was great. And they made, very easily, like no issue, made at the time a Spiaggia label. And it was awesome, I don't know the extent, I mean, I'd say probably more so for well than for anything super high end, but that's what my guess would be for that. Yeah.
Is private label primarily for your restaurants, or is it also for sporting venues?
I think it could be potentially for the sporting venues. Honestly, I've just recently started on the S&E side too. Restaurants, no problem. Like for our Chicago Restaurant Group, we've done private label work several times, and then on a national level too. But S&E, I don't see why that. I mean, again, it's just the level of availability because of the amount of juice that we sell. But to me, I mean, we obviously have our relationships with sponsors and things like that in S&E that we need to be sensitive towards. But that's not to say there aren't individual opportunities in specific areas of the country and things like that that would potentially work.
Yeah, that was actually my other question with S&E. Like, I know there's a lot of overlapping mandates and stuff that you guys have to manage through.
Yeah.
Like, roughly what percentage do you guys manage versus what is sort of mandated by the sponsors?
Well, the interesting thing about Levy is that each location is actually run by the ownership. So like we have to do what the ownership wants while also making our sponsors happy. So we try and have core programming, but we're also sensitive to the fact that like, hey, the 49ers is owned by a big wine guy. He loves wine. So what are we going to do to like also support our sponsors, but also celebrate the fact that he wants a wine bar in there and he wants to to support local winemakers, things like that. So again, it's kind of like a case-by-case basis from what I understand. But again, like we'll see. It should be pretty interesting to see how that develops. Yeah.
So when you say bye-bye, also say that just to know that there is a Cannabis Springs Expo tomorrow at the same location.
For us to reorder?
Cannabis Springs. And you can get your tickets.
Well, like I kind of talked about, it's the partnership. I mean, you're promising this quality, this level of juice, this packaging, the availability, the knowledge of how to sell it nationally if we're going to do it that way. Reordering, I mean, again, hopefully this would be something we could do on like a yearly basis if it's something, because establishing a private label to me is like hopefully a long-term relationship and commitment because, right, you want consistency in product, especially in something that you're making really great margins on. It's beneficial to you and me and specific to our restaurant group. So come with all of that and we should be fine moving forward together. Yeah.
Mike? Do you make a distinction between, or do you have a preference between private label where Levy owns the brand but goes through that whole creation process with your suppliers, or do you have a preference maybe if you're presented more control labels where you just pick something that's just ready to go now?
I think it could go either way, honestly, because we, like I said, there was that company that presented us with the Red Mountain fruit, and right, and that was like supposedly ready to go, but clearly it wasn't, and that's like an issue. So I think that would be a case by case basis of like, how are you coming to me with fruit that like we've already discussed, we know we could sell, we're interested in this varietal, like is it ready to go, or is this something like a big picture thing that we're looking to visualize and move forward with? I think that like that differentiates those two things. Anybody else? Yeah, of course.
Hold on just 1 second for the microphone. Thank you.
I know a lot of restaurant groups have really reduced their lists in the aftermath of COVID. Just wondering how you guys are you doing the same thing, or?
Yeah, some of our locations have reduced their lists. Just streamlined it. I mean, think about like our location River Roast in Chicago. They were sitting on a bunch of wine that hasn't sold, so they're like basically funneling all the wines through a smaller list and like eliminating before they rebuild. Not to say we're not going to rebuild. Spiaggia was another totally different example because that was a list that was, the restaurant was 37 years old and it had been built up over the years, and that was up for a James Beard Award for finalists for the last 2 years. So that that's a whole different thing. So like the cool thing about Levy is that a lot of it is a location by location basis, which is something that can be like a positive thing that can be said about the company, that we really want individual locations to have their own personality. And I think that's why I love the company so much, is that it doesn't, just kind of maintain this androgynous underlying thing. So, but that said, having a private label that could be sold within all of the locations, the restaurant locations or stadiums or whatever, could be really beneficial at the same time, right? And even if we did like, here's the River Rose private label, and then the same juice goes to Jake Melnick's, but then the Jake Melnick's label, or, like however we could do that would reflect each individual location, would be really cool.